technology so that if someone cuts in, that the vehicle is detected and they can spread apart. And so I've shown this video to a lot of folks, and I get one or two reactions. The first one is usually, oh, this is pretty cool. Like, this is, 10% savings on fuel. This is kind of enhancing the driving, and it's basically it's not allowing not needing the second driver to do anything on the gas or the brake. But then a lot of people just say, like, that's it. Like, this is the commercial thing. This is the self-driving truck that's actually being developed right now. They're trying to market this, and they haven't even finished the technology. And so, in some regards, the future of the automated vehicle might be a little bit less remarkable than we think. And in large part because there is a skeptical public, because there is roadways that have mixed use. Yeah?
So when you get the cut in, does it break the link, or does it just adjust for it, and when the person, do they stay connected kind of, once you push the button, they stay connected, or? I think
they stay connected, but the truck leaves enough room, and then eventually, if the car doesn't get out of the way, then the link would break.
Well, who gets to be first with the savings?
And that's a great question, right? In this case, both would save.
They both save?
Yeah. So there is savings for both trucks. The first truck actually has less drag behind it because the air bubble is actually the truck behind you pushing it. And so the first truck would save about 5%, and the second truck would save about 10% fuel.
Would you only have two trucks?
As this technology
You're not
is
going to have like 20 of them.
right, so they've done tests in Germany where they have 6 trucks following in 10 feet, and that's right, and that's the reaction is, ooh, like, would want to drive next to that, right? And that's consumers are really unsure about this technology. This is something that, whether it's for personal cars or for trucks, I mean, they're very comfortable with truck platooning. Drivers are not very excited to get behind the wheel of a self-driving car. They're much less excited to drive next to 6 trucks following at 10 feet. And we have to remember too that consumers, and this includes freight and freight and logistics companies, they're very price sensitive. I've got a picture of a Hyundai up there. It's a 2017 Hyundai. I rented it a few weeks ago. It didn't have cruise control. This cruise control has been around for 30 years, and it's probably a $50 component. But Hyundai recognizes that there's a market for vehicles that are $50 less expensive than not, and it's worth building vehicles that don't have cruise control. And so the technology for self-driving cars are going to be a lot more than $50, perhaps 10 times or maybe 100 times more of that, if not more. And so what is the consumer acceptance, and who's going to have the money to pay for this?
What's that car? We rented a car recently.
Yeah, that had level
But talk about it.
Well, it had lane following, and it had warnings when cars were in your blind spots. Just the standard level stuff.
What kind of car was it? Did you request it?
It was some Chevy, some mid-level Chevy. It wasn't very fancy or anything.
So it was just on,
2017 model, and it just had stuff built in.
it was on a car you rented, you didn't call and say, I want
No,
one too.
it was on there.
And some of the stuff is built in, and some of it's not, and it's, there's a website that's mycardoeswhat.com, right? And it's put out by the National Safety Council to address this situation. You're talking like, well, was it level 2? What did it do? I don't know, because a lot of people aren't really sure what their car's capabilities actually are, and that's a big problem. Is that not only with consumer acceptance but consumer education. How do we know what people are getting themselves into, and so they don't trust the car more than they necessarily should? So just as a summary on the AVs, and we talked about this at the beginning, we've advanced a lot on the easy part. I do think that safety in the rural areas has the most to gain in short term, because this is where the most people are dying. Idaho is a little bit bigger in population than the District of Columbia, where I live. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same. Idaho has a death rate on the highways of 10 times what we have in the district. And it's because you have a lot of rural roads where people are moving fast. And the number one cause of death is people leaving their lane. Whether they're tired or they're drunk or something happens, you leave that lane either into oncoming traffic or into a tree, and that's the number one killer on the roadways. And the technology that can keep you in your lane or can preemptively brake when you're not paying attention could save a lot of lives. And so some of the lower level safe driving automation is really, I think, going to be a big benefit to rural communities, rural areas, and areas where we're driving quicker.
But they're not going to implement it in rural areas first.
Except when it's on the Chevy that you rent or that you buy, when it becomes standard on vehicles. And again, we're a ways away before it proliferates. But a lot of the new Chevy pickup trucks and Ford pickup trucks are having this technology, and that's something that could potentially we could see a reduction in fatalities in the shorter term, long before we're seeing pickup trucks drive themselves around the farm. If we ever see that.
We drive our pickups every
I know.
we're
The future is really far from known, but there's all of these. We go back to that heaven and hell scenario. We can begin planning now how we want to see our communities develop, and we can start thinking about these things. And we could, I'm sure, talk for the next 5 hours about all the different things and scenarios and ways we want these to go on. But this is basically a summary of the automated driving. We can come back to it. If anyone has any burning questions now about automated driving, we can talk about it now, or we can wait till the end. Otherwise, we do have a couple other topic areas that I'd like to breeze through in the next 45 minutes or so. Of course, these are a little bit less complicated than the automated driving because there's a little bit less hype around them. They're a little more established. But we'll go into the ride-hailing discussion. So ride-hailing, this is the TNC, the Transportation Network Company. This is your Uber, your Lyft, your Via. There's a ton of different names for it. Some people call it ride-sharing, ride-hailing, ride-sourcing. There's a lot going on, but really how we're looking at it is the modern taxi industry. So instead of going on the street and holding your hand up and hoping that a taxi comes by, you can call one on your phone. So what I want to talk about in the next few minutes here is that public demand for this is pretty strong. It's growing. It's here. It's on the roadways. Uber and Lyft operate in the whole southeast part of Idaho, or southwest part of Idaho. There's been some big PR issues. Uber's been in a lot of troubles. There's been some scandals, but it continues to grow, and so does its competitors. TNCs, and I'm using that as kind of a blanket. There's a question whether they can function profitably in suburban. Oh, I'm doing it. Okay. Sorry. Can they they're very profitable in New York and Washington and Seattle and Chicago. Does it work in suburban areas or rural areas? That's a big question. And then the eventual goal of automated technologies helps remove the driver from the scenario, which is something that Uber would love to do because it makes it cheaper, perhaps. And that's a long-term question. Yeah.
So how does it, Uber, and then you have actual taxis, right? So I know there's been some controversy about, them undercutting taxis, and have they solved that issue yet, or how do they address that?
It's an issue that's raging all over the world right now. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's why I use the modern taxi industry is where we're headed. And it's going to be a little bit of a convergence where Uber has no regulations, their prices are very low, and the barriers to entry is very low, and so they're say down here, and the taxis are much more expensive, they've got a ton of regulations, and they're probably over-regulated. And so I think we'll see them eventually converge where Uber's prices will go up, we'll see a little bit more regulation on their side, and then the taxi industry is also going to undergo some pretty substantial reforms that I think are for the better. But for those that aren't super familiar with how this works, this is the kind of the company attributes. I know this is a little hard to see. It's not just one service, as we have here. So you have premium, you have large, you have different options. So when you open up your Uber app, you can get a fancy car, you can get a cheap car. They do require background checks for the drivers. There are ratings, so you can say whether their driver was a 1-star or 5-star. There's not specific destinations. It's not like a fixed bus route. You can just say wherever you want to go. There is a set fare. They do allow tips. This was something that both Uber and Lyft did not allow at the very beginning, and now they've allowed tips. But both of these companies take a cut. So it's usually between 20 and 25% of the fare Uber puts in their pockets, and then they give the rest to the driver. Uber's the dominant in the US. They have about 75% market share. Lyft has 23% market share, when the remaining couple percents go to a couple different companies that are kind of starting up. They have tremendous valuation. Uber is valued anywhere between $50 and $65 billion. On an actual operating quarterly loss of $650 million. Last quarter, they lost more than $500 million. Yeah.
Okay, so how do they lose the money? They're advertising? I mean,
So they're subsidizing fares. So the fares right now, because they're in a price war with all these other startups, and so the trip actually costs a little bit more, and they have to pay the drivers a little bit more than what it's costing. But for me, for example, they want to encourage me to take a ride, and so they say, okay, we're going to offer, a week of half-price Ubers, and so they're constantly offering discounts. I took an Uber trip downtown. It was 2.5 miles. It was $4. It's in some cases where a taxi would have been 14. It's shockingly cheap, and it's all about establishing market share. Because once you're big enough, you can kind of control the market. One thing that they found is that if you open the app and the wait is more than 3 minutes, you usually look for another option. If I open my app and I look and Lyft is 6 minutes, I'll say, okay, well, what's Uber? If it's less than 3 minutes, then I'll take it. And so that's part of the market share. If they're able to encourage more and more trips, they're able to have more rides in the road, they're able to have more drivers, and so then the weight gets lower, and then they can it's like a big snowball. And on the other side, it's a death spiral, right? If they're losing market share, if the trips are always taking too long to get to your house, then they lose customers, they lose drivers, and then they can go the other way. And then building on that, in about a dozen cities, there's carpool TNCs. This is Via is a competitor, Get, Uber Pool, and Lyft Line. Basically, if say I'm going from here to downtown Boise, I pull out the Uber app, and there is no Uber Pool here, but it's assumed there is. I hit Uber Pool, and I'm going, and we get a mile into the trip, and then we go off onto some side street, and we pick up Lindsay, and Lindsay's on my same route, and then we can share that ride. And it's cheaper for me, it's cheaper for her. We've got 3 people in the car instead of 2. There's a lot of efficiencies. And in some instances, some of the more dense cities, almost all the rides are Uber Pools, and it's hard to find more than a car that only has 1 passenger. And so they're showing that in the dense cities, it can work. But it's not necessarily something that can be in every place. And this gets at the suburban or certainly rural question that we were talking about earlier. But basic business model is Uber. It doesn't have any employees other than in their headquarters. They're very capital-light. They don't own any vehicles. All of that is devolved, and all of the drivers are 1099 employees. They're not part of Uber. They're private contractors. They actually do surge pricing. So right now, if you get a taxi here, there's going to be a set amount that you pay. In Uber, if you're trying to catch a ride after a ball game or after a big event, the price could be 3 or 4 times higher than what it was in off-peak times. And so they they surge pricing and they give discounts to manage demand and encourage drivers to be out on the road when demand's the highest. And then there's everything is done electronically from a payment standpoint. If you take an Uber trip or a Lyft trip, you get a receipt in the mail or in your email, exactly where you went, who you went with, how many stars you gave them. It gives you all the information, and you got a very detailed report. And then there's constant experimentation. And this is kind of, and I'm using Uber here, Lyft is doing the same thing. Uber Family, in select cities, you can order a car with a car seat, in case you have a kid. Uber wheelchair accessible vehicle, you can click and say, oh, I have a wheelchair, so you can order a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Uber Eats is a food delivery service, so it's the same platform, but instead of moving people around, you're moving food. So instead of being a delivery man for Pizza Hut, you're a delivery man. And you can, one trip be Pizza Hut, and the next trip could be Domino's, and the next trip could be Chinese food, and so you're not kind of beholden to one company. Autoplay music, I can have a setting where I want to listen to Bon Jovi on my ride, and as soon as the trip starts and gets in, and Bon Jovi's playing on the radio. You can split fares with your friends, so you can say, hey, I'm taking this ride with Jessica, but we're going to split it, so you do that all on the app. Uber Freight is for truck drivers. Maybe they're taking a load from here to Washington State, and then they need a ride or a load for the way back, and so they use Uber Freight to find that return load. You can send ETA status updates to your friends or your family. You can get credits at select stores, and it can alert you if you're passing by a certain store. It's this incredible platform to think about what you want to do with it, what you can do with it. And all of these companies are constantly experimenting, which is also driving a lot of their losses right now, is they're trying all these things out. A lot of them are expensive to deploy, and it's not sure if they're going to be on the platform for a long time, but this is what's driving the valuation, is a lot of investors see this and they see money. And how can we extract everything from that rider? And it's a really interesting way to think about transportation, more than just I need the point-to-point taxi service.
Captive customer.
Exactly, right. I mean, that's a big part of it.
So they're going to work with Starbucks, that when you get in the car, you'll have your Starbucks there for you?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
That's another good idea. And like those kind of things, because they have so much venture capital funding, they can try that out. Say, okay, in Seattle, we're going to try it. We know that you take this ride every day, and we know that you like your pumpkin spice latte in the fall, and so the driver's going to pick up the latte for you and pick you up at 7:55 when you go to work. You know, you can kind of envision this whole kind of convenience thing. Right, and you have to pay for it, of course. This is not coming for free, but for people that have the means and like to commute via Uber, which there's actually a shocking amount of people in some of these cities that do, you can kind of envision how this could roll out. We talked about drivers. Every time I'm in an Uber or a Lyft, I talk to the driver and say, what do you think? And some of them are disgruntled and they're not super happy with how much they get paid. Pay varies a lot because of surge pricing and all these things. But a lot of them really like the fact that it's a flexible schedule. A lot of them are part-timers, they're in between jobs, they're students. You can work for one trip, you can work for 12 trips, you can work in the night, you can work in the day. It's whenever you turn on the app and you're in your car, you're working. Whenever you turn it off, you're off. And other than that, there's no rules. And so,
The car has to be a certain age.
yeah, they do have different specifications. But they've actually relaxed that a little bit on the basic service. I mean, you can have the expensive cars that you pay, like the Uber Black. You would need to have a certain age and a certain style and a certain cost. But a lot of it now is based on just ratings. So if you fall below 3.5 star rating, then Uber says you're done, you're out. And so and you get rated as a passenger too. And so it kind of goes both ways. You have to behave as a passenger, don't vomit in the back seat, right? And you have to be good as a driver, have a clean car and all those kind of things. And then this gets at some of the battles. So there's no federal law, there's nothing going on at the federal level, but a lot of localities and states have struggled to regulate Uber, in part because there's a huge demand from the public, and so they don't want to discourage that because there'd be a political backlash. But there's also a lot of concerns about safety. There's a lot of lobbying from traditional taxi services that say, hey, we don't want these guys because it's not fair. The medallion taxi system, which has kind of limited the amount of taxis in a lot of big cities like New York and Chicago. Chicago medallion used to be worth about $600,000 or $700,000. People would invest a lot of their money into that, getting that medallion, and now it's worth maybe a quarter or a tenth of that. Medallion prices have fallen, and it's been really hard on the taxi drivers. Even abroad, I mean, this is an example here in Barcelona where they outlawed Uber for a little while because of unfair labor practices, because of safety concerns, liability issues. And each city, each state is different. In Austin, they passed a regulation that said that all Uber drivers have to be fingerprinted. And Uber didn't like it, and they tried to fight it, and Uber lost. And so Uber and Lyft both pulled out of Austin, and they haven't been in Austin for a long time. And it's really kind of created a lot of a secondary market, and all these new firms have come in to Austin. And Uber's very slowly kind of going back in and saying, okay, fine, we'll do the fingerprints, because it's a market and they want to compete. What's that?
Was that an illegal issue? Fingerprints or?
No, it was totally legal. It just Uber didn't want to comply with that. They feel like they have their own vetting system, and the taxi industry did have to have fingerprints, but Uber drivers did not.
Do you have to be a citizen?
I don't think so. I think that it's very loose. It's a contractor employee. I think you need to have a personal identification number or a social security number so they can issue a 1099, because all the employees are 1099 employees. But aside from that, I don't think there's that in a background check. So as long as you can provide an EIN and a background check, pass background check, you're in. So getting at, we were talking the kind of the future taxi market. Taxis are overregulated, and TNCs are underpriced because they're subsidized by the venture capital, and taxis, eventually we'll see this convergence, and we're already starting to see that. And there's a new app called Grab Taxi, where in Washington D.C. you can actually use that to, on your phone, hail a taxi, and it works just like Uber, except you're in a car that you can publicly hail. You can't publicly hail a Uber; you have to call it on a private phone. Now, there's a lot of forcing that's eventually we're going to see this convergence. But again, the question is and can TNCs function profitably, especially in suburban and rural areas? Right now you can catch Uber and Lyft here. I don't know if that's going to be around in 5 years. I don't know if it's going to be around in Washington in 5 years. It's really from a profit standpoint. It could be just in the most dense cities or in the cities where they can manage to get enough drivers and enough coverage. So this is kind of an unknown space. So we're gonna jump into the technology in public transit, which is a lot related to this. But before I leave, is there any questions or thoughts? Or has anyone used Uber here? Uber, Lyft? Okay.
It's fabulous.
Yeah.
Do all states allow it now?
Yeah, pretty much in every state. The only city that has the fingerprint, it's not a ban, but it's a fingerprint requirement right now, is Austin. Yeah.
I know with like companies like Via, you can buy, basically invest in their software and either use your own vehicles, it's like the transit authority or different things. Have you seen anywhere where they take the software and implement it with traditional
Yeah, Uber for a while had Uber Taxi, which you could as a taxi driver get, you know, and they took that away for some reason. I don't know if that was a commission, taxi cab commission that pushed back on that. But a lot of taxi cab commissions are really in dire straits. I mean, in DC, you can get a DC taxi cab and take it across the river to Alexandria, and that DC taxi cab cannot pick up anyone in Alexandria because that's the jurisdiction of the Alexandria Taxi Cab Commission. You know, it's those kind of regulations that are kind of crazy, that are hurting a lot of the workers and the efficiency of the system. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of demand for taxi cab industries to adopt these technologies. And a lot of times they're not developing their own, but they're adopting someone else. They're saying, hey, grab taxi, come in here and implement it system-wide. Because that does add that level of convenience to the same level of what Uber and Lyft are doing. And then it just becomes an issue of price. Yeah.
Quickly, what do you think about the statistics? Hailing Uber and Lyft is reducing BMTs on the overall transportation network. For every Uber trip, it's supposed to reduce BMTs by X amount. Have you seen those?
Yeah. So there's a lot of conflicting research that goes into that, and then you look at some research will say in San Francisco, 25% of all the traffic downtown is Uber and Lyft drivers looking for a fare.
Well,
It's a huge amount. That's the city that has the most intensive use of Uber and Lyft. That's where they were both founded. And a lot of people think that if the Uber pool and the Uber and the Lyft line, the kind of the shared services take off, there's a lot of potential for reduction in traffic. Again, that's probably taking a lot of folks off public transit that would be taking public transit anyway. In some instances, it's taking folks off the road. So the bottom line is it's inconclusive. On a personal anecdote, I live in the city. I don't own a car, in large part because I have access to hundreds of cars on my phone. Anytime I need to go somewhere, I can use a car sharing service. I can use Lyft or Uber. I can use the bus. I can use the train. I've got so many options that it's really enabled me in a way that if it weren't for that, I would probably have purchased a car at this point, because there are some places that just aren't easy to go to. But when we added up what we would have paid in insurance and car payments in a year, which was $3,000 or something of that nature, versus the amount that we spend on car rentals and Ubers and Lyfts and those kind of things, it was way more economical to not own a car, given where we live. And so that is one where I think it does reduce traffic, because if I had a car, I'd probably use it a lot more. Yeah.
So if you want to take a trip somewhere though, like a couple hours, do you just rent a vehicle?
Yeah, so my family, so I live in Washington, my family is in Cleveland, 6-hour drive, and we usually walk over. There's an Enterprise car rental in the neighborhood about half mile from the house. Go over there, rent a car for the weekend, and drive that back. And that's, a weekend's usually $100 or $150. And we do that once every other month, and so if you add that up, it's a lot cheaper than car.
In DC.
Yeah, I don't know what car insurance is in here, but in DC, it's great.
That's what DC.
Okay, so there's a lot of discussion about how can public agencies work with somebody like Uber or Lyft or one of these technology companies to subsidize or have a partnership with the first mile, last mile service, bring people to transit, improve the paratransit service for ADA folks and people that are in wheelchairs, can help people make better decisions. You can open your app and know that the 3 bus runs between downtown and the airport, and it's leaving every 15 minutes or whatever. Could it replace bus networks in low-density areas? There's a lot of these questions that agencies are exploring right now. And what we see, there's a huge opportunity for partnerships, but there's been some problems with marketing and letting people know that this exists. It's because it's so new. I'm going to talk about the goals versus the technology. I'm going to go through 3 different examples of partnerships that we've seen in this country and how people aren't always so sure that it's a cost savings. And then, of course, there's barriers when it comes to procurement and the public rules that public agencies have to follow. And then the last point on here is in big cities where you have very high densities and high density traffic, it's not going to replace a subway system or a high capacity bus system, but it does have a lot of potential to interplay in lesser dense areas. So the 3 case studies I talked about, we're going to talk about one in Los Angeles, one in Kansas City, and then one in Florida in the Pinellas Suncoast example where they subsidize Uber. So this was a partnership between LA Metro. They were opening their new Expo rail line. It was not a financial transaction, so they didn't actually sign an official agreement, but Uber said, okay, we're going to provide half-price Ubers, and LA Metro would advertise that. And this was a way to help bring people to the stations, was help to show them that this line is now open, it's running. This was an example that lasted, I think, 2 months of how agencies can somewhat informally partner with an agency to help encourage better use of the system and also not spend a lot of money to do so. The second example was in Kansas City, the Kansas City Area Transit Authority. They partnered with a company called Bridge. Bridge provided a flexible bus service. They basically took maps of cities. They were operating in Boston and in Washington, where they were trying to find the areas that weren't served well by bus, but still had the densities to provide commutes. And in Kansas City, they identified a route that went from one of the areas about 3 miles from downtown to downtown, and they started running this bus service. They were expecting about 200 riders per day. The bus was going to go back and forth. It was going to be flexible. So instead of having a defined route, it would go from this general area to this general area, which is this neighborhood to downtown, and you would request it on your phone. It would come kind of weave through and pick up a bunch of people, take you downtown, and leave you very close to your office. A flexible bus service. The result was both positive and negative. On the positive side, we received a ton of media visibility. Everybody across the country was talking about this partnership. This is great. This is the first time this has happened. The folks we talked to a bunch of the folks at KCATA. They were going to conferences to speak about this and how they make it happen. But instead of getting 200 riders a day, they got 5. From a ridership standpoint, it was an absolute failure. And they tried to really advertise it. They put money into the advertising budget, and they moved from 5 riders a day to 11 riders per day, and eventually discontinued it. And then frankly, shortly thereafter, Bridge went bankrupt and was no longer in operation. And it shows in part the challenge of the technology and the flexible bus route. And it also shows a little bit of the challenge of their approach, which is they said, hey, we've got this shiny technology, let's implement it, rather than, hey, we've got this problem, let's find something that serves it. And so it was a technology in search of a problem, and it didn't pan out very well for them. This next example is Pinellas Suncoast. This is a transit agency that serves the St. Petersburg area in Florida. I hope that everyone down there is doing okay. I know that they've had a tremendous weather event over the last couple of days. But about a year and a half ago, they created Direct Connect. This was in response to 2 problems. The first was there was a university in the area, and they were having some problems with drunk driving. And they were also experiencing, they had a system that didn't operate after 7 o'clock at night, and they needed a way for workers to get home without operating buses all night long. And so they had these 2 problems. Both of them operated at night, or were not operating at night. And so they said, well, let's create options for folks. And they actually partnered with Uber, with Lyft, with a local taxi company, and with the wheelchair accessible vehicle company, who kind of hit all the different political and procurement areas, and they gave discounts. They said $5 discount on your ride, and they had fixed prices for the taxi and for the wheelchair accessible vehicle. But the Uber and Lyft was standard Uber and Lyft, and you just basically you logged in with this app that gave you a $5 discount, and Pinellas Suncoast transferred that money directly to Uber, and so they were directly subsidizing those rides. It was tremendously successful. They've seen increased growth in ridership. They've actually seen some increased trips on their bus network because people are using it to get to the main trunk lines. And they've expanded the area in which they're doing this from what was a 5-mile square area to now their entire system. And so within their entire system, they're giving these discounts to folks. And this is generally seen as a pretty positive example of partnership with the transit agency. Yeah?
Remind me of what geofence means.
Yes, that's a great question. That is a technical term. So what you would do is you would open up your app, and it would show like a barrier on the map in which that service would operate. So it was only within this. It was kind of fenced in from a geographical
To
standpoint.
and from.
Right.
It has to be within that.
It was anywhere, you could go anywhere or leave anywhere as long as it was within that barrier. So yeah, sorry.
But then it expanded into the whole.
And then it expanded and they got rid of the geofence and it was within their entire service. So then the geofence was basically at the edge of their jurisdiction.
And is that one working?
Yeah, they've because they've expanded it, they've continued to operate it. They're meeting federal requirements because they're offering service to wheelchair accessible folks. The taxi industry is allowed to compete, and they're kind of part of this too. So they haven't had big pushback from the taxi industry. This part of Florida is very low density. It has a lot of elderly folks.
Right.
And this has been what the agency has seen as a pretty successful pilot project. I couldn't get any cost numbers in terms of the cost per ride, but there's some potential there for this option. And one of the reasons I think that they've seen it generally successful is they first identified the problem, which is drunk driving and access for workers in the late night, and they found a solution that worked within that problem rather than the other way around.
This might be the example, but have you read Kevin Kelly's The Inevitable?
I have not.
He mentions an experiment, it sounds very similar to this, where, you know what our situation is here. Do you?
In what sense?
Our public transportation system.
I rode the 3 bus in from the airport today.
Oh, good for you.
It was $1.
A free bus.
It was $1. I paid my fare.
Anyway, and this experiment was similar to this, but it was a city that did not have a very good bus system into outlying areas, somewhat not very dense, very similar to the Trumbull Valley. And they got an Uber arrangement rather than extend the bus system because it penciled out better. And I just wondered if you were at all familiar with that kind of arrangement.
Yeah, those kind of pilots are starting to pop up all over the place, and it's still experimental. And there's some areas where they're dealing with wheelchair accessible vehicles, other procurement rules that apply from a federal standpoint, and there's also a problem of cost. It's of course not cheap to run a 40-foot bus through a neighborhood without a lot of people. But there's an example, I don't have it up here, but in Boston, they have a paratransit, wheelchair accessible or kind of disabled and elderly service in the city of Boston. And they said, okay, we're going to also allow you to take Uber and pay the same fare. And so the city would subsidize that remaining fare. And the difference was that with the traditional paratransit service, you got to call 24 hours in advance. You got to have a very specific time when you're leaving. And Uber, call it, and within a couple minutes, it shows up at your door and it'll take you exactly where you want to go. So a tremendous benefit and a lower cost. Where the 24-hour service, that was a $33 per passenger subsidy that was needed to make that. With Uber, it was $11. So it was a third of the price. But the problem was that so many people wanted to use it. In fact, it was so convenient that 4 times the amount of people wanted to use the Uber service that it ended up being more expensive for them to operate this service when they were subsidizing Uber rides along with these 24-hour in advance rides. And so it became a problem, and they didn't have the budget to continue the pilot, so then they cut it back to the same old junky service that they had before. And that's a real problem for agencies, is you by offering a very cheap, on-demand, take you anywhere you want service, basically a taxi, for a very low fare, people take it. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's a problem.
What was it, like 4 times the amount because people were traveling more because it was more
It was more convenient.
convenient?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But
there's
the more people were using it.
If you obviate the investment for that 4 times service, that if you were to provide that with the public, the buses, the paratransit.
Well, they weren't, so this was completely new riders. So they
I
were,
know.
they kept it.
So what you've done is you've increased the access for all of these disabled people
Right.
Right.
by not making an investment in an old system.
Yeah. So we had a really interesting meeting at the AFL-CIO, which is the main labor group in Washington, D.C. Kind of oversee all the different unions. And they were very upset about a proposal to have Uber come into Washington and provide disabled transit services. So they brought in a bunch of taxi drivers and a bunch of other drivers, and then they brought in this guy who was representing the blind transit union, riders union. This guy was blind, and they were expecting him to come up and say, how he needs to have these unionized drivers because it's really important and they provide all this great service, and Uber is this terrible company. I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but one of the things that he said on the panel that kind of took everyone by surprise is he's like, I love Uber. He's like, as a blind person, I can't hail a cab. As a blind person, it's hard for me to even call in and reserve because I don't know when they show up. So he's seeing this as a big benefit. He recognizes that the drivers need to be fairly compensated, and there's a lot of issues when it comes to kind of balancing out kind of the total free-for-all that the market is right now for Uber and its drivers. But I think that a lot of folks with disabilities recognize that this could be a big boon for their mobility. Yeah.
About federal funding, what is the role that the federal funding for transportation today plays in all of that? Is it pushing us to stay in the old route instead of going into the new one, or?
Yeah, so one of the barriers right now is procurement laws. And procurement is very important because it helps protect against waste, fraud, and abuse. And it helps enable vulnerable citizens to have the same access as we do as able-bodied adults. But there's a lot of antiquated rules that have kind of layered on over time. And so the question is how do we revise those to ensure that the same protections are in place while also being a little bit more nimble, a little bit more able to innovatively procure for these services in a way that advances public interest. And so tomorrow, for those of you that are going to be in this session tomorrow morning, where we've got a little bit more time, we're going to kind of dive into some of the procurement issues that are part of that. A lot of agencies that are doing these pilots, and there's a few more on this page. There's a lot happening. A lot of them are using local funds only, so they're not using their federal dollars, so that they don't have to be subject to federal rules, which is fine for a pilot. But once those become institutionalized, or if they become institutionalized, they're going to have to reconcile with what federal procurement laws are on books. You had a question?
You know, it's actually very similar to what was just asked, but it's really this funding adaptation that needs to happen. I think the example in Pinellas was really showing that there is a demand for our seniors to access transit. The accessibility that it opened up this new market. And then hopefully that can lead to either funding adaptation to allow the transit agency to fund differently how people move and access public transportation. But I think it's just a great way to show the general public that we have to be adaptive in the way we think about funding.
And I think this is forcing the transit industry to think, what is public transit? And that's a really interesting question. And how do we take very limited public dollars that we have and use them to provide the most accessibility that we can, while also achieving a bunch of other public sector goals in the process. And that's why the pilots that are happening are really important. There's the last one on here is the Federal Transit Administration is funding a sandbox where they've kind of said, okay, where they put aside $8 million, they selected a dozen agencies and they said, we're going to waive the procurement rules. We want you to go out and test something innovative and tell us what you find. And some are partnering with Uber and Lyft. Some are partnering with some of these micro transit, like a Bridge, but Bridge doesn't exist, so one of their former competitors, and seeing what works and documenting it so that we have a good sense for around the country. But a lot of it is just agencies trying it out and not being afraid to see what they can do. Yes?
How do you see this changing with the Trump administration?
So the Trump administration is very keen on private investment. And so I think that in general, they're very much, they want to see a lot of this. But the MOD sandbox grant was a Obama administration test pilot. And we're actually involved in some of the MOD sandboxes, and we've seen the Trump administration continue to press on and make sure that those are actually happening. So within this, the administration is still very focused on their $1 trillion plan. We haven't seen that go anywhere. They haven't talked about any specific policies on this front. So it's really to be seen yet what actually will roll out. Yeah.
What does VTA mean?
Oh, the Santa Clara Valley Transit Authority. So this is the San Jose region. So other examples that we can think about, we're not going to go into these, but phone maps that are applications like Google or Google Apps that can help route you and guide you and say, okay, I'm going from here to downtown. Well, there's a bus, and there's also Uber, and there's bike share, and there's a lot of different options I can take, and it's all in one place. Open data, a lot of agencies are publishing their bus data, and they're creating next bus applications, letting the private sector kind of create these free applications. And then there's employer incentive applications. This is something that we've seen in a couple cities where instead of providing parking or along with providing parking, they have an app. And every time an employee takes the bus or bikes or walks to work, they get an incentive because the employer didn't have to provide parking that day. And so then those credits can then go and apply to an Uber ride or something like that. And so you have applications to use basically game theory to help encourage employees to make choices that benefit both them and the employer. So again, this is the same slide I had up earlier. This is the summary. There's huge opportunity. We've got to focus on goals, not the technology for technology's sake. Sometimes it's more expensive than we expect, and so we can't think of it as just a cheap option. And again, this is not going to replace the high capacity lines, but really the ones that have a need for flexibility. So I know we've got about 10 minutes left, and luckily this is the shortest section here. the sharing economy, and this is separate from the other ones because the sharing economy is not sharing rides or sharing, it's sharing assets, like a bike or a car, where you have bike share, you have car shares, that all have slightly different models. Technology has made sharing very easily. We're not very good at sharing, but technology is one of those things that's made it cheap, made it easy. It's paired with some revitalization of downtown areas now that there's a lot of activity, a lot of bike share and car share are happening in areas where there's a lot of density of people. There often needs to be a public-private partnership, so it's not something that's just going to happen in a vacuum. But again, it has, I've overemphasized the ease part. Bike share is proliferating around the world. In the US, in 2001, there was 1 bike share in this country, and last year there was 121. The biggest user, the big chunk of the pie here is China. China is a huge user of bike share. The USA is here at about 9% of all the bike shares in the country. And there's 2 different models. One, you have a docked bike system, which is in the upper left. This is where the bikes have to return to specific stations. You lock them in and you can unlock them using your credit card. And then the other is dockless, where you can park the bike anywhere. The system that's in downtown Boise is kind of a mixture of these 2. You can lock it to a dock system for free, or you can leave it anywhere downtown and just let it lie on the street. Basically, it does lock to itself, and they charge you a $2 fee for doing that. But those are kind of the 2 different models. There is a government role because it does require a public subsidy and it requires public space. A lot of companies are providing the technology. You're not seeing public agencies developing their own bike share technology and building their own bikes. But what you are seeing is that the companies do come in. And sometimes they can turn a profit. Washington, D.C. has enough revenue to cover its operating profit, although the city has put millions of dollars into buying bikes and the bike stations. So from an operating standpoint, it, in some instances, not all, can cover its profit. But there's challenges. One is mismatched demand. This is an example in China where everybody rides downtown and then there's not enough places to put all the bikes. And so they end up in these giant bike mounds all day and it takes up public space. And in DC, there's a bike share system where sometimes you take and you commute downtown and all of the bike share are full and there's nowhere, because it's a dock system, you can't park it anywhere. And that can be really problematic. It's also, it has a demographic challenge.
What do you do?
What's that?
Be there, there's no place to put the bike.
So then you have to find another, you have to open your phone, and you have to find a bike, another system, you take it to another one, maybe a couple blocks away. It's very inconvenient. Or you sit around and you wait for someone to take a bike, which would be wild. From a different demographic standpoint, this is the Washington, D.C. system. Over 80% of the users are white. And if you look here, this is household income. The green bar is 50% of the users are making $100,000 or more. So bike share systems in Washington, which has a sizable ethnic and African American population and has very stratified income, the system, which does require a lot of public subsidy, is primarily used by rich white folks. And that's brought up a lot of debate in the city of why we should be spending a lot of scarce public resources on something that benefits primarily that demographic. And that's a challenge. I'm not sure what the actual solution is. It's something that we're debating a lot, but it's something that comes up an awful lot with bike share.
They tried talking to the poor black people to ask why they were doing it.
They have, yes. And the number one, there are 2 responses. First is, I don't have a credit card. You don't have a credit card, you can't use it. And if you do, when you do pay for it, there's a disclaimer that says, if anything happens to this bike when it's in your control, you have to pay for the bike, which is $1,000. And that is also a big deterrent for people that don't have a lot of money.
How do they expect anybody to
And that's a big problem, and how do you overcome those two things? And that's not necessarily exclusive to bike share. Any of these transportation options we're talking about, they require this, and a data plan, and a credit card, and that brings up a lot of the demographic challenges that transportation and technology have.
With elders too. I mean, a lot of them don't know how to use a cell phone if they have one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a real problem, and I think that's incumbent on transportation planners to figure out those issues, to find a way to make it work with cash, to find a way so that folks that don't have a phone or don't know how to use an iPhone can call it. And that's especially when we're talking about spending public dollars on these things, whether it's transit, whether it's a bike share, whether it's a car share system. It's a real challenge for folks in the public sector.
Car share has the same.
What's that?
Are they Ubering at all if they don't have technology? Or?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of folks do have, but you have to have a credit card, and you have to have, you also have to have the means. In Washington, they just raised the bus fare by 25 cents. There was huge public outcry.
It is now.
$2 per ride, one way.
So you have the same demographic challenge in car share.
Yes, very similar demographic challenges with car share for a lot of the same reasons. And there are three models. There's the cars in designated spaces. This is the zip car model, where you can pick a car. It can be a lot of different kinds of cars, but you have to return it to that same spot. Then there's one way. This is car to go, where you can park it anywhere on the street. So in Washington, for example, it's geo-fenced around the city, and you can pick it up on anywhere in the street. You can take it where you want to go, park on the street. Sometimes it's there when you come out of whatever you're doing, and sometimes it's not. And so that has its challenges. And then there's peer-to-peer, where if I have a car, I can rent it out to folks when I'm not using it, and they can come and they can take my car, and then they'll pay me for that. A lot of times insurance, gas, maintenance is included, internet reservations, everything's done on your phone. Just talked about these. So the question is sharing going to take off, or is it kind of just where it is? And this is a picture of my son. I've always got to put him in my PowerPoint. He's 14 months, and he's got a lot of energy, and he knows, as a 14-month-old baby, that sharing is an inherently less outcome for him. He knows that he's worse off when he shares. And we're very struggling to teach him. And when you go to the playground and someone has a toy truck, you have to share that. You can't just take it and run away with it. And human adults are a lot the same way. We like to have our own things. So the only way we see an expansion of sharing is that if it's very easy and it's very cost effective. And so that's kind of why I put that bullet in there twice. Is it has to be easy. There is again some of it has to do with the revitalization of downtowns and the dense living that kind of necessitates, and it needs some kind of public partnership, either to allow cars to park on the road or to subsidize the cost of a bike share system or what have you. And so that brings us to the end of my agenda. I have kind of a slide here that shows how this